Medical anthropology is the cross-cultural study of health, uh, health problems, and the way people deal with that. As all elements of cultures are well integrated, the way we deal with health and illness is strongly linked with all other aspects of the society we live in. It's linked with wealth or poverty. It is linked with the way we organize the education system. It's linked with our religious traditions and beliefs. It's even linked with political systems. You'll see that throughout the PowerPoint. How a country, even today, the good example I can give you is this COVID-19 crisis. The way political systems are organized will influence how people deal with controlling the spread of the virus. In totalitarian countries, in countries where there is less civil liberties, they will deal differently with that, maybe with a different success. We'll see that throughout this PowerPoint. The study of health and illness starts with how people perceive the dichotomy or the non-dichotomy between their body and their spirit. In the Western world, we have a very strong dualism between what the body is and what the spirit is. It's in this dichotomy is everywhere in our daily lives, and it's also in our belief system. The body will die, but the spirit will remain eternal. So we have this very strong notion of dualism. It comes from the Greeks. It comes from a long time ago. As when you hear a healthy spirit and a healthy body, well, it comes from centuries ago. This dualism is not present at the same degree everywhere in the world. In some other cultures, the body and the spirit are seen as totally connected. They go together. So in such systems, there is no strong difference between mental illness and physical illness. It is just illness. It's being unwell. So mental illness is not necessarily perceived as it is perceived in our Western society. We have to keep that in mind. This dichotomy is not present everywhere. Now I will explain two different perspectives on pathology, the relativist perspective and the universalist perspective. Before I start, I have to explain what pathology means, because I realized in the last years that students don't necessarily know what it means. Pathology, in the context of what we study here, means illness. So this is what it means. So when you hear pathology, means illness here. There is no good or bad way to have a perspective on pathology. So the relativist perspective and the universalist perspective are both good perspectives. They have to be considered together to have a complete overview when we study pathology. So let's start with the relativist perspective. It means that people from different cultures understand illness differently. And that is really important, and that is what I will focus on throughout this PowerPoint, because in anthropology, we are interested in cultural differences. So the relativist perspective says that illness is culture specific. This is what we'll see. One example of that I usually give in class is a health problem that is present cross-culturally, no matter where you live. When men get older, some will suffer from erectile dysfunction. And this health issue will be perceived differently in different cultures, will be accepted differently in different cultures as well. In the Western world, men do not accept that because it's not accepted to get old. People don't want to get old. We live with this cult of youth here. And if it happens to men, their first strategy is to see a doctor to have prescription drugs, like Viagra, for example. If you live in China, you'll have a totally different perspective on that. Men, their first strategy will be to go to the market and to see the herbalist and to buy some natural remedies. As you can see on the right picture here, you can buy dried seals' penises and take it in your tea or in your food, crushed into a powder, and it might really well work if your erectile dysfunction starts with a psychological aspect here. So different cultures, same health problem, different perspectives here. Also, the relativist perspective on pathology will admit and focus on the fact that what is problematic, what is pathological, what is seen as a disorder or illness in a culture might be totally normal in other culture. One example of that is homosexuality. It's totally normal here. You're different, but you're not sick. It's even illegal to try to treat people for that. It's not a disorder. In other cultures, it is seen as a health problem and people will seek remedies for that. Another example is the Asperger's syndrome. It's a form of high functional autism. One of my cousins has Asperger's syndrome, and he's awesome at remembering dates. He knows all the dates of the whole world history. It's crazy. But he needs a lot of help for social interactions. Here in the Western world, the Asperger's syndrome is seen as a disorder, as a I cannot pronounce it, as a neurological disorder, and you need treatment for that. So, for example, my cousin has accommodations in schools, has a lot of help with that. Place the same person in a society where people depend on oral tradition. It is not considered as a disorder. The same person will have a lot of status because he can remember everything, when things happened and with whom, and so he will be the guardian of the oral tradition in another culture. So same disorder, different perspectives here. The universalist perspective on pathology will focus on things that do not change across cultures. It will focus on the fact that even if human beings live in a lot of different cultures, a lot of different traditions, we all share the same body systems. We all have the same respiratory system, nervous system. So according to this perspective, the understanding of pathology, of health and illness, should be universal because they are symptoms and they are cures that will work for everyone in the world. So this perspective is not better or worse than the relativist perspective. It is just complementary. Both work. So when we study health systems around the world, we have to consider both the relativist perspective and the universalist perspective on pathology. To reconcile these two perspectives, to put them together, one has to consider, when they study pathology, two types of symptoms that people have: central symptoms and what we call peripheral symptoms. And if we consider these two types of symptoms when we study pathology, then the two perspectives are used together. Central symptoms are those observed all around the world. in the same way. And I will take the example of depression as a pathology. As you noticed already, I focus a lot on mental disorders and not physical disorders here because this is what's interesting in anthropology. Huh? So central symptoms in depression are observed everywhere in the world, and these will include sadness and lack of energy. These are two symptoms of severe depression that are seen equally all around the world. Peripheral symptoms are those that are culture specific, that vary across cultures. So, when people suffer from severe depression, they will have as central symptoms sadness, but they will have other symptoms that will not be the same. They will depend on where people grew up and their culture. Studies were made with depression in North America and China, and interesting results were found. In China, when people suffer from severe depression, they will very often have intense pain in their body. And this is not observed here so much. Scholars say it is observed in China a lot because people have a much closer connection between the body and the mind than we have here. And this will explain that body pains. In North America, people who suffer from depression will very often express guilt as a feeling. And this is explained by the fact that we live in a very individualistic society where you're supposed to be autonomous, you're not supposed to need help from people around. And you feel guilty when you need help. And when you suffer from depression, you need help. This is why guilt is very often observed here, but not in China, because of the nature of the collectivistic society in China. It's normal to help and to need help. So people will not feel guilty when they have depression. And here in North America, people will not feel so much pain in their bodies because the body and the mind are much more disconnected. From now on, in the study of health systems around the world, we will focus on the relativist perspective on pathology because this is what is of interest for us in anthropology. We have seen already that the nature of illness and the symptoms of illness will be culture specific very often. Now we will focus on the culture-specific aspect of what is causing illness, the way to prevent illness, and the way to treat it. But let's say a few words about the culture-specific nature of illness. In the Western world, we have very convenient practical tools to determine what is an illness, what is not, and to classify illnesses. The first one is the ICD, which includes mostly physical illness and has a chapter on mental illness. So we have a dichotomy here. I will not discuss the ICD in this course. And we have the DSM. Now you know the DSM because you've studied the DSM in psychology, or you will do very soon. The DSM is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. It's a book that is supposed to contain all possible mental illnesses people can suffer from. This is very convenient for psychologists to diagnose illnesses. It is also very convenient for other aspects of life like insurance. If you suffer from an illness that really exists, then you can have coverage. It is not an imaginary illness. And the DSM, we work now with the 5th edition that came up a few years ago. It's the DSM-5. The first edition came up in the 1950s. It needs to be updated sometimes for very good reasons. The nature of illness, what we consider illness, is changing throughout time. For example, in the DSM-1, homosexuality was listed as an illness, and it's not anymore, of course. And also, new illnesses appear in the society. For example, the DSM-5 probably contains some sort of illness or name for addiction to gaming, online gaming, or cell phone addiction, and it was obviously not in the previous editions. So these need to be updated. So this is for the DSM. The DSM is a very good tool, but it can be considered to some extent a little bit problematic for anthropologists because the DSM does not include most of what we call culture-specific syndromes. I will talk about that in the next slides. A culture-specific syndrome is a disease or illness that exists in only one culture of the world. One example of that. When I was working in Peru, when I was digging in the countryside, I was hiring farmers living in villages nearby to help me digging, especially the upper layers that are really harsh and hard to go through. So one day, one of my workers disappeared. And they have no cell phone, so there's no way I can reach them. So the guy disappeared 1 day, 2 days, and the third day the guy came back and told me, I'm sorry I was sick, and I hope you will pay me anyways. It's not my fault, I was not there. So of course I paid the guy, but I asked him, why were you away? Why did you miss work? And he told me I was cursed. I couldn't come to work. So for me, it's obviously not a reason, but for him, he was cursed and he was not able to come to work. Probably was really feeling ill, but for him, his interpretation of that was a curse from someone. So this can be considered a culture-specific syndrome that is obviously not in the DSM. If I don't come to work at the college, being cursed is not a reason to give to the HR people. So it does not exist here. This is an example of culture-specific syndrome. So culture-specific syndromes are health problems associated with a particular culture or a particular group of cultures in one area of the world. They are not imaginary illnesses. They're real illnesses. Sometimes they're interpreted in a specific way by people because they do not know about medicine or science or they didn't go to school. It depends. There is a wide array of culture-specific syndromes. Your reading about the sleep paralysis is about a culture-specific syndrome. And the last question I was asking you was to find a culture-specific syndrome for that reading. I don't know if you did it yet, but you will have to. In the past years, I had very good examples of syndromes, illnesses that exist in only one culture. I would say there are two kinds of culture-specific syndromes. The first one being associated with beliefs and behaviors and cultural traits. My worker being cursed is a good example of that. He believed that. So this is for one type of culture-specific syndrome. I will give you examples in the next slides. The second type of culture-specific syndrome is illnesses and mental health problems that exist because of the situation in one country, the economic situation or the political situation. That's the second type of culture-specific syndrome. For example, PTSD in immigrant children coming from war zones here. Syrian children will often show signs of PTSD. That would be here considered a culture-specific syndrome because it's because of the political situation they were living in. I will give you two examples of culture-bound syndromes. They're also called culture-specific syndromes, folk illnesses. So all these terms mean the same thing. We'll give you examples of culture-bound syndromes that are linked with cultural traits or beliefs. I chose two examples from Japan. The first one, which I cannot pronounce, and by the way, if I'm asking you a culture-bound syndrome in a test, you do not have to know the name. Just the description of it is sufficient. The first one is the fear of offending people because of how you look, your physical aspect or your body. Example, you're afraid of blushing or sweating or having bad breath or things like that. It's a cultural trait in Japan where people are very polite. So this is linked with that cultural trait. This fear can exist in many countries, but not at a large scale as in Japan, and not enough important to put a name on it as Japanese people will do. Another culture-bound syndrome from Japan is karochi. This is a word to say death from overwork. This is especially a problem in Tokyo, but it can be in any major city. Men work very long hours. They have a lot of pressure to perform at work, and they commute long hours to go back home. So for that reason, that is not necessarily linked with the culture-bound syndrome, but men, as you see in the picture, will often rent a cubicle like that to sleep at night. Just a few hours before coming back to work. So you work really hard to midnight, you go, you sleep a few hours in there, and early in the morning you get up and you go back to work. You don't even go back home to sleep. So this is an example to show you how men will work very seriously and hard. So there's a higher incidence in Japan of stroke or heart attack in young men linked with stress and long working hours. It's high enough and important enough to give a name to it and to be considered as a culture-bound syndrome. Of course, this can happen in any country. It happened in England a few years ago in a firm of lawyers where young men were having strokes because they were pushed too much to work. But in Japan, it takes more important proportions, and this is considered a culture-bound syndrome. Both these culture-bound syndromes are linked with cultural traits, how people behave in a specific country. Now, two examples linked with the economic or political situation in a population. The first example is from the Inuit population. It's Piblitok. It's rare today, but it was much more widespread in the past when Inuit populations only had access to their traditional foods in the winter. This syndrome is you faint, you become hysterical, and then you faint. And this is caused by not enough calcium in the diet paired with an overdose of vitamin A. Because the diet is strongly focused on sea animals during the winter. So there's not a lot of calcium in there, in seals and fish and whales. And there's a lot of vitamin A, which is bad for your body. Overdose of vitamins is generally not dangerous, but for vitamin A, people have to be careful. So both these aspects of the diet will cause this syndrome. So this is directly linked with economic situation and diet, life conditions. Another example is the resignation syndrome. This is seen in Sweden. This was documented mostly in Sweden in immigrant children from Syria. These children were in a situation where their family was in danger of being deported back to Syria. So adults can handle the stress better, but children could not. Some children could not handle the stress of it, so they started suffering from depression that became more severe until the point where they were in bed, unconscious, in a coma. And these children were had to be fed with tubes by force, otherwise they would have died. We call that the resignation syndrome because life is for them is so stressful that they prefer dying from not eating and drinking and being active. Uh, it's really strange as a syndrome because these children did not respond to any stimulus of pain. If you put ice on their bodies, they do not respond. Their blood pressure, their heart rate are not rising. So they don't feel apparently physical pain, but they are still aware of what's going on around them because most of these children exit the coma when their families is when their family is accepted in Sweden as official immigrants. So they hear somehow what's going on around them. When they exit the coma, it takes a lot of time for them to resume normal activities. So it's a very powerful mental condition that is present in North Europe in immigrant children. So that's an example of culture-bound syndrome that is linked with extreme political situations. Now I will talk about the perceptions of the cause and prevention of illness in different cultures. This slide and the following one are very important, and they are in the test. So make sure you understand that really well. So cause and prevention are considered differently in different cultures and sometimes differently in the same culture as well, depending on the generation or the social situation of people. The first way to interpret illness in this perspective is the naturalistic interpretation of illness. Naturalistic, what I mean here is the opposition to supernatural, okay? Naturalistic as an opposition to supernatural. So this happens mostly in countries and cultures where people are better educated. They're wealthier and they have a better access to scientific knowledge around them and education. So in this interpretation, illness is caused by the natural world as opposed to the supernatural world. So, of course, prevention, cause, treatment, all this is based on natural factors. It can be traditional medicine like herbal tea, plants, but it can also be modern medicine like antibiotics, chemotherapy, etc. So for this interpretation, what is causing illness is many factors, but all based on nature, like germs, bacteria, viruses, parasites, all contagious things. Aging is a factor of illness as well. Genetic condition, you can have a genetic illness. Bad life habits as well, bad diet, no exercise, too much stress, not enough sleep. All these will be factors considered as causing illness in the naturalistic interpretation. It goes together with how people will prevent illness. They will seek medical treatment based on science. They will practice good hygiene. They will practice vaccination. They will try to eat well, to sleep well, and to exercise. These are all factors of prevention of illness based on the natural world. The naturalistic interpretation says that illness is caused by the natural world, not the supernatural world. In opposition, the personalistic interpretation of illness is based on the belief that illness can be caused by the supernatural world. This happens a lot in countries where people do not have access to scientific knowledge, don't have access to good education. So in this type of interpretation, the prevention of illness, the cause of illness, the treatments will be based on supernatural factors. And something that is important to say is that in nearly all cultures, both naturalistic and personalistic interpretations are considered. You will see here older people maybe say that, oh, some epidemics is caused by God, or it's human beings being punished, or you might hear this. Okay, I've heard my grandmother in the past saying something like that. So this is the personalistic interpretation of illness, mostly seen in older generations. In a lot of countries, people will have both interpretations together. For example, some illnesses will be considered as being caused by the supernatural world, the bad eye, el mal ojo, being cursed, whereas some other illnesses will be considered being caused by the natural world, cancer, the flu, etc. So it depends. Both interpretations will exist in most cultures, but the personalistic interpretation is based on the supernatural world. Examples: people will think that some diseases might be caused by evil spirits, by God's punishment, by them not behaving well with other people, etc. So prevention will include aspects like praying, performing some rituals, performing some maybe sacrifices or offerings, wearing amulets on people's bodies. These kind of things will be done to avoid getting sick with certain types of illnesses. I had a funny example of that in the textbook I was using in the past years. This example is based on the disease that you have read about in your article, widow ghosts, angry ghosts, attacking young men in their sleep. I'm not sure they say that clearly in the example, in the article, but this sleep paralysis thing exists in all cultures. They say that. But in some parts of Thailand and Southeast Asia, it is much more widespread in the population. And the fact that young men die in their sleep is caused by a medical condition that some men have. And it's more common in Southeast Asia because of the founder effect. It's a genetic theory that I will not explain here. But it's much more widespread in Southeast Asia because more men suffer from a specific genetic condition that make their heart beating slower. And in the night when they sleep, their heart sometimes beats so slow, then it stops, and it's causing sudden death in otherwise healthy young men. And people are afraid of it because they can't prevent it, and they don't know why it happens only to young men. As you know, a lot of genetic diseases only affect men, like hemophilia or being colorblind, for example. It's really rare in women. So they interpret that disease as being caused by the ghosts of women in specific areas of Thailand. They interpret this disease of being caused by the ghost of women who are not satisfied sexually, and they wander around villages. And they think these widow ghosts attack young men in their sleep to rape them. And they enter the house, they rape young men in their sleep, and men die because of it. So to avoid widow ghosts from entering their houses, young men will put these phallic shapes, wooden shapes in front of their houses. You see on the picture, they're coconuts for testicles. So they think that the widow ghost will just stop there, do her business, and go away, and you will not die in your sleep. So this is a belief. It's an example of the personalistic interpretation of illness. They have the belief here that the illness is caused by the supernatural world, ghosts, and it can be prevented in a supernatural way, as you see here. To continue with the personalistic interpretation of illness, in a lot of countries, some people are considered to have special abilities to treat health problems that are caused by the supernatural world. We call them in anthropology folk healers. They will have different names. They will be called curanderos in Latin America or marabout in French Africa. It depends on where you are. They have different names. In some cultures, as you know, some illnesses will require modern medicine or the hospital, while other will require the healer. Or when you don't have money to go to hospital, you go see the healer. A universal health care system as we have here is really not granted to everyone in the world. The hospital is expensive, so healers are popular for that reason as well. When you can't afford medical treatment, you go see the healer. Healers work in different ways depending on the country they are. For example, in West Africa, marabout will heal you by you lie in the dark, and then they will recite verses of the Quran to you, very in a soft voice, over and over and over. It can last an hour, and then it will alter your perception, your mind, and you will feel better. This is how they work. I've seen folk healers working in Peru. They work in very different ways. What they will do is they will work during the night on archaeological sites. This is why I've seen them working. They will lit fires. They will chant and dance and drum. They will spit perfume on people. They will rub stones in their bodies. So it's a whole healing session in which people's senses are all in action. They smell things, they see things, they touch things, so it has an effect on them. Healing sessions involve psychotherapeutic techniques. The placebo effect, power of suggestion, what I mean here is the placebo effect will work. They will also, healers sometimes in some contexts, will also act as mediators with people you are in fight with. So they will kind of try to fix your relations, and it's supposed to make you feel better. They will use hypnose, and all these techniques will stimulate neurochemicals in people's brains, and it will make them feel better. It does not cure illness, science says, but if some illnesses are being worsened by stress or anxiety, it will work on that. So people will be in a better mental state to get a cure. It works really well as well in some populations for pain management because it works on people's psychology. Shamans are something else. They are a special kind of healer. So not all folk healers are shamans, but only a specific category. Shamanism comes originally from Siberia, North Russia. It is pretty widespread in Native American populations because probably it came with the first population crossing the Bering Strait thousands of years ago. It's a very old practice, and it is based on the belief that there is a parallel world of spirits, and these spirits that can be good or neutral or evil can affect you. They can, among others, make you sick or heal you. So, important difference between the shaman and the healer. The healer heals you himself or herself, but the shaman does not heal. Spirits heal. The shaman is just the middleman between the two. So they act as mediators between the world of the spirit and the world of the humans. Another important thing, when shamans use drugs, they use the drugs themselves, whereas a healer can give you the drug. So this is another difference. To communicate with the spirits, shamans need to use a specific technique we call trance. Trance means altered state of consciousness. So the shaman needs to be in a trance to communicate with the spirits, to ask them to heal you. So trance can be achieved in many ways. Popular ways will include chanting, drumming, dancing during a long time. It affects people's consciousness. You get high by drumming, boom, 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 during an hour. There are here on the left picture traditional shamans from Siberia drumming. Another popular technique is taking hallucinogens, taking drugs to achieve an altered state of consciousness. On the right, this is a San Pedro cactus. growing in South America. This is a popular way for shamans to heal people, to communicate with the spirit. Other ways will include fasting during many days, bloodletting, losing blood. When you lose a lot of blood before passing out, people have hallucinations. It's dangerous, don't try it home, but it's a technique that is used as well. So, shamans will enter trance, an altered state of consciousness. They will communicate with the spirits, and the spirits heal people. It's based on the belief that there is a world of spirits that can actually affect people's lives. Now I'm going to talk about epidemiology. Epidemiology is not necessarily linked with anthropology, but it can be. In this case, we call it cultural epidemiology. Epidemiology by itself is the study of infectious diseases and everything around it. How they appear in the world, how they spread, how we can prevent and cure. So, avoiding the spread and transmission of infectious diseases is a task for medical staff, but it is helped and it's accomplished much more effectively when medical staff understand how people behave and their cultural behaviors. A good example of that, that is kind of too early to talk about it, is the COVID-19 crisis we're in. But we're in the crisis, so it's really hard to get conclusions now. A good example I can use is the Ebola crisis of 2014. You probably remember that. It happened in 4 countries of West Africa that were specifically affected by this crisis. And doctors had a lot of difficulties helping people avoiding the transmission of disease. And anthropologists helped a lot with that in the field. Doctors had difficulties because of 3 specific cultural traits that people have in West Africa. The first cultural trait is compassion. When someone is sick, the family naturally will visit them and help around in the house. And when there's a virus around, like the Ebola virus, it's the last thing you want to do. But people still did it because it's a very important trait in the culture to help people. Also, traditional funerary practices are not the same as they are in our society here. In the countryside, specifically, but everywhere, a lot of people die home, not in the hospital. And it's the task of family members to wash the body and to bury it as soon as possible, within 24 hours, generally in these countries. And also, in the case of Ebola, bodies are contagious even after death. So homemade funerary practices, as it is tradition, had to stop. And other cultural traits important there is visiting folk healers because of beliefs and also because of financial limitations. It's really expensive to go to the hospital to see a doctor, so your first reaction when you're sick is to see the folk healer. So people visiting folk healers means crowded places, people visiting the folk healer at the same time, and a false sense of security. People feeling protected by the folk healer, but not protected in reality. So anthropologists worked with people in the field to change these behaviors. For example, they convinced people not to visit those who are sick, to call them and to wait to visit them after, or if there's possibility, to wire money instead of visiting to help. Funerary practices changed. It was really hard for people to change their grieving practices, but it happened. And folk healers had to drastically change their practices as well. And it worked. The crisis lasted a year maybe, but it was under control because people changed their cultural behaviors. For the present international crisis we're in, over the world right now, people agree much more to change their behavior when possible. One example of that is there are major Muslim holidays coming up, and people will not participate, or will participate only with their immediate family in their own house. There's Easter coming for Christian people. Practices will change around that as well. Spring break just passed, and Americans had, it was really hard to convince some young people, but they had to change their behavior to avoid the spread of disease. On the picture, what you see is in Iran. It was 2 weeks ago. It's the Persian New Year celebration. Traditionally, kids during the New Year celebration, they gather all together in the street with their parents, and they jump over bonfires. This is to ward away sickness. But these days, gathering in the street is definitely not a good way to avoid sickness. So kids massively in the capital of Iran, in Tehran, what they have done recently is, instead of bonfires in the street, they started jumping over candles in their homes. So this is a small change in behavior that help avoiding the spread of disease, because Iran was affected a lot by COVID-19. So everyone around the world have to change their cultural behaviors. Sometimes it is very hard and nearly impossible. Think of poorer countries where there's no people have no fridge in their house, so they really have to go to the market every day to get their food. So sometimes it's impossible to change the behaviors because of the financial condition a country is in. So in a few months or years, looking back, we're going to see how cultural behaviors influenced in many countries the spread of that disease we're in.